Okay, here we go. Commandment number 6, do not murder. So I had one person come up before we started and said, is this going to be a contentious class? So hopefully it won't be contentious, but hopefully we'll have some good discussion. All of the slides that I have are leading up to the last one. So if I do it well, we'll have 10 minutes to talk about one slide. If I don't do it well, we'll be hurried through it. So we're more than halfway through now. We've got do not murder. We've got 4 more after this one. So that's what's coming up. A brief review. So now we've got the first 5 commandments. And why do I call them out separately? Just as a reminder, no other gods before me. He is our creator. Remember the idea of reorienting ourselves to Eden, the perfect situation. So basically, allow me to paraphrase, God saying, I am the one, none of these others are anything, right? Because there were a lot of gods in Egypt. There are no other gods than God. No graven images. You can't worship God. You can't contain him. There's nothing that we can do on this earth. The rest of that commandment is, don't make a graven image of anything in the heavens, on the earth, or in the seas. So it's really that idea of there's nothing you can do to represent me, God, in a physical image. Do not take the Lord's name in vain. No false oaths. Don't mishandle the holy gifts of the Old Testament. Don't blaspheme God. Don't prophesy falsely. Even God's name is holy. So when we speak about him, when you talk about a thing or a name, it's the representation of the person or spirit that we're talking about. So even God's name is holy. We should treat it as such. Remember the Sabbath? And again, I told David after that class, it was really good because it really reminded me that this is an idea of we need to rest, take time to focus on and remember God. And then the reminder there is on a weekly basis. And then finally, honor thy father and mother. God created us and is our spiritual father. Parents are God's physical family for us. We should respect them respect them here on earth as we respect God in heaven and worship God in heaven. So those are the first 5. And if you think about it, it all starts with man's relationship to God. It's an individual relationship between us and him. The family unit, so the first 4 commandments really look at that. The family unit is the first unit of grouping here on earth, and that's commandment 5. And then it branches out into society, and that makes up, from an individual perspective, many individuals, how we actually interact with each other. And I thought Daniel's lesson this morning was really apropos as to how all this fits together. So visually, the 10 commandments, they really start small and then expand outward. So you think about the first 4, starting with God, then go into the family, and then society. And then I included this time, love God, and again, you heard it this morning, love your neighbor. That sums up everything. And if you look at it, it actually fits really well. Those are the 10 commandments. So, without even opening the Bible, Exodus 20:13. Someone quote it. Come on, it's on the screen. You don't have to quote it. You shall not murder. Thank you. So the topics for today, and again, I really want to spend about 25 or 30 minutes leading up to this. Why is murder wrong? I'm not being flippant. Why is it actually wrong? And the parenthetical statement is really important here. If we take God out of the equation, what's the fundamental issue with murder? And then let's get into God's perspective on murder, both Old Testament, New Testament, and then what does God want us to learn about today? So, why is murder wrong? Right? The text says, do not murder. Well, what does murder even mean? What's the definition of murder? To kill someone unlawfully and with premeditation. Now, there's a question around premeditation, but that's the Merriam-Webster definition for today, from today. So I think there's some extra biblical evidence regarding murder as well. How many countries have a law against murder? All. By definition, murder is to unlawfully kill. So everyone has something on the books with that. But what I want to start us off into is from a moral and ethical lens. What does this actually mean? So what is morality? Bring out the glasses. Both morality and ethics loosely have to do with distinguishing the difference between good and bad, right or wrong. Where do we read what's good or bad or right or wrong? Okay, so so I heard in the Bible, which is absolutely correct, this part of the class, we're taking God out of it. So if there were no God, which there is, if there were no God in today's society, how do we understand what's good and bad, right or wrong? Use your mic.
Okay, you really want me to say that again?
Yeah.
Popular sentiment in your culture or your people?
Okay. How else would we know what good and bad or right and wrong is? Okay. Morals? Okay. So we're going to get to all those. So morals, ethics, and legal. So many people think of morality as something that's personal and normative, whereas ethics is the standard of good and bad distinguished by a certain community or social setting. So morals, people think that's what I feel, right? There's a moral right and wrong. And the interesting thing is that murder is one of those where everyone just kind of knows it's wrong. But what makes it wrong? Everyone knows it's wrong. It's wrong to take someone else's life. So from a morality perspective, not everyone, not 100% of everyone, but enough of everyone in this world that we live in today, 7+ billion out of the 8, think that murder's wrong. From an ethical perspective, that's where there's a whole lot more leeway that people talk about. And that's where we get into what does society think? So ancient Greece, ethics are a branch of philosophy that investigates questions such as what is good and what is bad? Is it just to reward one group with more benefits than another? So in practice, ethics are decision-making tools that try to guide questions of human morality by defining concepts such as good and bad, right and wrong, virtue and vice, justice and crime, etc. There's a lot more than that. I shortened it. So, yeah, go ahead, Ian.
I just think when I look at these two things, morality versus ethics, I see morality as what's been given to us instinctively through God's plan and God's creation. It boils down to do unto others as you would want them to do unto you. If you don't want somebody to do something to you, you probably shouldn't do it to them. And that's kind of just a natural definition of what is right and wrong, of morality. And then ethics is our attempt as human beings to define it and put it in a box and manipulate it.
Okay. So someone else. So building on that for a second, before the Mosaical law was given to the Israelites, how did people know what to do? How did people know what was right and wrong? Okay. So God told them, but we read about something in the New Testament called the natural law. And again, I'm not going to get into that in this class, but the natural law, as I understand it, and please feel free to discuss it for a couple of seconds here, but is that innate, right? The natural law means there's something within our hearts and minds of what's right and wrong and how to operate. Anyone have a different definition or supplemental to that? Justin?
I would add, and this kind of goes back to what David was saying about the societal and cultural influences. I mean, if you were in a society where there was no law against murder, anybody could kill whoever they wanted, everybody would be living in fear. So it doesn't benefit society as a whole. So it's when you have an outcome like that where everybody is impacted negatively, then it's going to push towards setting a precedent of, okay, murder is bad. Now, the ethics of it is, defining murder within a governmental body, right? So, okay, well, we've decided that just willy-nilly killing each other is bad, but if we do it in the lens of, well, we're going to go and conquer this nation, well, now we can do it. So that's where I think that there's kind of a subjective line there on how it gets defined.
Thank you. And just thinking about that for a second, when we go back to the founding of this country, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the preamble, are those legal documents? I'd say no, because I'm just there. What to me is that they're in the framework of morality. They're saying, here's our intent for the country. This is what we're thinking. The founding fathers, we want the country to work this way. The legal comes where we're about to see later, the U.S. code, right? There's a code of laws. If you do this, then here are the consequences. If you do X, Y, Z, and there's federal, state, local, county, I don't know about county, depends on how your state's organized, and then city and other. So there's different layers of laws. But I think that when I think about those founding fathers, there's like, here's how we want this to work. And to me, that's really the ethical and moral framework that they have then provided for the country that we then build laws on top of. But I'm free to have other dissenting opinions, because everyone to the T said, yes, it's a legal document. But this is not where we're going to spend our time this morning. Okay, Terry's got something. Go ahead, Terry, as soon as David gets there in 1 second. Here we go.
One thing to always reflect on, that God always spoke during the patriarchal period. He spoke to the fathers of families. So there was always communication with God somehow. And of course, after that, we have the Mosaical law. And then, of course, Paul mentions about the natural law and the law that when he gave the Gentiles up because they started worshiping other gods and disregarded what he has set out for everyone to do. Though they were still under the same law as we are, but it took Jesus Christ, who died for our sins, and that got us back with God.
Thank you, Terry. And obviously, we're not going to. I'm trying to focus in on the foundation so that we can understand God's perspective in the light of how we look at it today. What Terry pointed out is so true. You can't take God out of the conversation, because from the very beginning all the way through till today, he is in the conversation. Now, people may choose not to acknowledge that, but he is still in the conversation. Go ahead, Steve.
Is the Constitution a fundamental law? Does it codify the laws or the feelings of the people? And then does the courts interpret, those particular feelings of the people, or the fundamental ideology of the people? I would argue that you could maybe call it a fundamental law.
Mm-hmm. They're all connected. They are the principles that we are built on, and clearly our justices go back to the Constitution and say, is whatever our law that we passed in agreement with it, right? Correct, with the original. So, question, as we get into the legal part before we move on, if there's a law that the community abides by and you disagree with it, does that make it wrong? Or does it allow you to disregard it? So I want to hear the contrary position. David says yes.
Clearly, it's a nuanced thing,
Yeah.
but it's written black and white. But the obligatory, they're banning speech at this juncture. If you misgender somebody in Canada, you're subject to persecution and being whatever credentials you have removed. This is a true thing that is happening. That's the law. Do we as Christians disagree with that? Is there man and woman? And the rabbit hole goes deep on that with any other law that we may disagree with.
Yeah, and I think that gets back to it, right? So there's always as long as it doesn't conflict with God's principles and God's law. So what are laws? Laws are a system of rules with a particular country or community recognizes as regulating the actions of its members in which it may enforce by the imposition of penalties. Okay? They're binding custom or practice of a community. Again, typically codified into actual words that people can see, understand the implications of. It's a rule of conduct or action prescribed or formally recognized as binding or enforced by controlling authority. So, is all murder equal in the eyes of the law? So the question, if murder is the unlawful killing of someone, then how can there be various degrees of murder, right? We've got murder in the first degree, murder in the second degree, we've got voluntary manslaughter, we'll look at them in a minute. But have we overcomplicated things? Yeah, so let me show you really quickly. So Title 18 U.S. Code, Chapter 51, Section 1111. And this was originally, the latest edit was 1940, but then there have been many amendments since then. So murder is the unlawful killing of human being with malice aforethought. Every murder perpetrated by poison, lying in wait, or any other kind of willful, deliberate, malicious, and premeditated killing, or committed in the perpetration of or attempt to perpetrate any arson, escape, murder, which I thought was fascinating. They put murder in the definition of murder. Kidnapping, treason, espionage, sabotage, aggravated sexual abuse or sexual abuse, child abuse, burglary, or robbery. Or perpetrated in part as a part of a pattern or practice of assault or torture against a child or children, or perpetrated from a premeditated design unlawfully and maliciously to effect the death of any human being other than him who has killed a murder in the first degree. That's a first degree murder. A second degree murder, anything that went up there. Really? So what was God's command again? Pretty straightforward. Don't murder. This is what happens when law comes into effect, because people can either be or not be. Manslaughter was introduced in 1986, apparently. And please correct me if this is wrong, and I'll get it corrected up here. That's just what I found in my research. Two kinds. Manslaughter is the unlawful killing of a human being without malice. Voluntary, upon a sudden quarrel or heat of passion, and involuntary, in the commission of an unlawful act not amounting to a felony, or in the commission in an unlawful manner, or without the due caution and circumspection of the lawful act which might produce death. Okay. Are there any lawyers in here? Just show of hands, please. Okay. I would love to have a conversation at some point. But the range of penalties varies on first-degree murder, second-degree murder, manslaughter. So, right, there's different penalties associated with it depending on circumstances. That's why we have judges. So to summarize, moral, your personal belief, this is how I summarize it. Ethical, generally accepted right and wrong in society. Legal, law as defined by society. These, if you want to live here, these are the rules you have to abide by, otherwise you're going to suffer the consequences. So, question. From a moral, ethical, and legal lens, what makes killing someone intentionally, illegally, murder, wrong? So what I think where Dan's going is, and we're going to get there in about 5 more slides, I hope. It's a heart problem. It's an intention. And as I went through some of this preparation, I kept thinking, if you've got the first 5 commandments right, if you actually honor God, there's no other God before him, no graven images, you're worshiping him as he desires, the nature, his name. If you've got all that right, then how can you take someone's life? Because it dishonors God. It's not honoring your father and mother. Last week, there were a lot of Old Testament scriptures that talked about a wayward son is going to bring dishonor upon his mother or his father. Guess what? That's going to bring dishonor upon them. So if you've got the first 5 right, the next 5, David, I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but the next 5 won't happen because you've got the first 5 right. Dan has a comment?
When I was growing up, my time, there was a lot of concern about whether you could be in the service and kill somebody.
Yeah.
There was debate about whether you could join the service and kill somebody, take their life.
Yep, and that's still an ongoing concern. Ian has a comment too, David.
David mentioned this back in the beginning of the class, but I think it, like you said, it's a heart problem. It has more to do about murder is wrong because it starts with anger and malice towards another human being, towards a brother or a sister, one of God's children. And that leads to a number of potential sins, and murder is just one of them, right? It could lead to stealing, it could lead to envy, just hate in your heart, right? The opposite of God. And so I think on a fundamental view, it's because of anger this is wrong, and God is saying, murder is the ultimate enactment of your anger. It's basically the worst that you can do to someone else. It is the worst that you can do, is to take their life.
Thank you, Ian. And then Jordan?
So maybe just quickly, just another perspective, I guess. So I totally agree. There's a hard issue here. There's a morality issue. There's ethical, things like that. But in Exodus chapter 20, that's not, it's pretty black and white. This is an action law is what we're talking about. So God doesn't say, don't think about murder, don't think about committing adultery. They may say that in other places and whatnot, but here on the law, when it's given, it says you should not do this specifically. So you totally get the morality, the ethical question, make sure our heart's in the right spot, yes. But when it was presented here to the Israelites, it was an action law.
Thank you. And we are, so a lot of what we just talked about is the last slide, which is the what about us today, where God has extended it, extended the intent, but this is do not murder, full stop. And there were exceptions. So the question is, what have we left out of this equation? And the answer is clearly God. And again, I'm trying to get down to the why. Go ahead, Albert.
Follow on Jordan's coattails. In context, God is talking, he has selected this group. He is making them, he's calling them out, making them unique and special, and they are going to represent him as they go through this journey to fulfill to be able to maintain and hold the lineage preserved so Christ can be accounted back to the promise. If they are a group and they're out and they come across another nation and they conquer and God hasn't given that approval, that's murder. If God tells them, go and take this nation out, that's not murder. And so I totally agree with the today application, which we're going to get into later, but also want to talk about but just share the mindset I'm thinking of in context. He's got these people are to stand out and he's trying to help keep them organized so they can preserve themselves as best as they can humanly possible. We know how many errors they made throughout the years, and I would not have been far from making those errors, but in context, they can't go out and be murdering if they also are to be labeled as a special and chosen nation.
Good. Steve has a comment?
I think it's fascinating that God said to Cain, the voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me. And so as we look at blood and how it is that Jehovah sees that, I think there might be something that would add to this equation as to why it is that murder is heinous in his eyes. And I mean, there's other places in Scripture where he makes that very clear.
Is it murder for a lion to kill a wildebeest? Is it murder for me to shoot a deer? No. What is it? It's man who's created in God's image. You are destroying something that was created in God's image. That's the entire difference, I think.
Yeah, so thank you. Very, very good point. This is human on human, and humans were created in God's image. So it's a good segue. What does God want us to understand regarding murder? So I wasn't comprehensive here. I don't think my count's comprehensive either, but the intent was to capture the commandments as much as we could, where you shouldn't do something as opposed to someone did something, right? So examples versus the command to not. So what does murder mean? Smith's Bible Dictionary, the law of Moses, while it protected against accidental homicide, defined with additional strictness the crime of murder. It prohibited compensation or reprieve of the murderer, or his protection if he took refuge in the refuge city, or even at the altar of Jehovah. And we've got lots of examples about that. The duty of executing punishment on the murderer is in the law expressly laid on the revenger of blood. Again, this is very Old Testament focused, right? But this is where we're starting. But the question of guilt was to be previously decided by the Levitical tribunal. So even the revenger of blood couldn't just go, hey, so-and-so killed somebody, I think it's murder, I can go take action. No, there was still someone evaluating the circumstances and then making judgment based on God's law. In regal times, the duty of execution of justice on a murderer seems to have been issued by some extent by the sovereign, as was also the privilege of pardons. And we can see that in 2 Samuel and 1 Kings. It was lawful to kill a burglar when taken at night in the act, but unlawful to do so after sunrise. Again, thinking about you have visibility, right? You can make a better judgment if you have eyes that's going on. So the designed and malevolent taking of human life was by the original appointment of God, a crime to be punished by death. Cain, already brought up, the first murderer, recognized it as such, Genesis 4:14. The ground for the death penalty for murder is in the eminent dignity and sacredness of man as a child of God, Genesis 9:5-6. We can see that. Like the Sabbath and marriage, it is a primeval and universal institution for mankind, and all nations have so recognized it. Okay, so that's the context, but question, this is before the Mosaical law, okay? Did the Egyptians have a law against Moses, against murder? I think I already gave the answer away. Yes, look at Moses. What was Moses' reaction? He fled. In the course of time, Moses grew up. Then he went on to see his own people and watched them suffering under forced labor. He saw a Hebrew, one of his own people, being beaten by an Egyptian. He looked all around, and when he didn't see anyone, he beat the Egyptian to death and hid the body in the sand and then ran away. Because when Moses went there the next day, he saw two Hebrew men fighting. He asked the one who started the fight, "Why are you beating another Hebrew?" The man said, "Who are you? Who made you our ruler and judge? Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought that everyone knew what he had done. So he was afraid of the consequences of his actions. So when Pharaoh heard what Moses had done, he tried to have him killed, judgment, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian. So did Moses commit murder under our definitions or God's definitions? or both of them? So I heard a yes. Seems like it. So the definition of murder: murder is causing irreparable harm to another individual. Once you take that life away, you can't give it back. Gone forever. Made in the image of God. What is that harm? Taking the life away. Who gave life to begin with? Okay, you didn't need to see that. You already knew the answer. Whose image are we made in? If you murder and take someone's life, who's an attack against? God. What happens to society if random murder is acceptable? Random taking of life with no consequences, right? There's no consequences of this. What is the ultimate outcome? Society falls apart. Not quite as eloquent as what Ian said, but yes, it's a breakdown. So, okay, Old Testament, it's mentioned 20 times. The New Testament, we see 21 times. And these are the counts that I'm not exactly positive about. These are the counts I made. Exodus 20:13, Deuteronomy 5:17, you shall not murder. Genesis 4, Cain murders Abel. Cities of refuge, this is a big section here, and there are lots of references to it. I'm not going to read through all these, but those are the passages where the word murder shows up. And again, remember back to that concept of the Levitical tribunal or some body assesses, right, what happened, and then it's either murder or not murder. If it is murder, then the avenger of blood can go execute the judgment against it. If it's not, then if the avenger takes action, then that's murder, because it wasn't murder to begin with. That wasn't the punishment that they should take. So more for the Old Testament. It gets smaller because there's more. So Psalm 10, verse 8, he lies in wait near the villages. From ambushes, he murders the innocent. His eyes are secretly against the helpless. I can't imagine if I didn't have glasses on. So I'm not going to try to read through all these. But these are Psalms, right? So these are either pleas or examples of what they've seen, mostly from David. How long will you assault a man? Psalm 94:6. They kill the widow and the alien and murder the fatherless. Hosea 4:2. There's cursing, lying, murder, stealing, and committing adultery. They break boundaries, and bloodshed causes bloodshed. So as we look through all of these, Psalm was how many years approximately after the Mosaic law was given at Mount Sinai? A couple hundred, 300, 400, somewhere in that range, possibly more than 10, okay? Many years later, and they're still having the same issues. So God, again, at Mount Sinai was very specific. This is what you will do. And you will do it because of commandments 1 through 5, right? Worship me as I expect. I'm your God, listen to me. Hosea continues. Then we have Isaiah 33:15. He whose ways are true and whose words are upright, he who gives no thought to the prophets of false acts, whose hands have not taken rewards, who will have no part in putting men to death, and whose eyes are shut against evil. Jeremiah, and then two examples here, Jeremiah 41:4. It happened the second day after he had killed Gedaliah, and no one knew it. And then Judges 9:24. For the violence done to the 70 sons of Jerubbabel might come, and that their blood might be laid on Ahimelech, their brother who killed them, and on the men of Shechem who strengthened his hands to kill his brothers. Throughout the scriptures, you see that. Before we get to the Gospels, one more notable one I left out. The man after God's own heart. Who? David. Who'd he kill? Uriah. And commit. So even, who didn't? Yeah. So I didn't put that up there. That's a question. Ian, and then
I sense a rabbit hole. Again, I think we're looking at this so literally, like we're missing the point. In a way, we're missing the point. Like the end goal is to not commit murder, but the first problem is the anger, right? That's where the sin starts, and it can lead to many bad things. But God, when we commit murder, is God asking that somebody else on earth make a rule that we have to die too, that we need to shed blood? No, God is saying, do not murder. End of line. Like there's no additional statement after that, right? Unless, somebody did you wrong, or unless you're in a war, or unless. Man has created all these rules throughout all of history around what murder and what means and what that means, and we've tried to make it okay. God says it's never okay. Because David committed murder, if God wanted him to die, he would have killed him. He would have made that happen, right? We've taken another life, but God says, do not murder. A soul is a part of God. It is precious. It is divine. And God is saying, you do not have the authority to take that. Only I do. Because that's a part of me, of my creation. So I think, yes, do not commit murder, but do not have anger in your heart against anyone, because it can lead to these things. Don't try and redefine what I've already defined for you.
Thank you, Ian. One more comment, and then we'll...
I was just going to say, with regard to the Moses example, it brings up the question of self-defense or the defense of another person, right? So is it murder if you act in self-defense? I don't know.
Yeah.
Do we want to get into the discussion of pacifism or all of that, right? I would just say you have to really understand what the definition of murder is. Is it all taking of life, or is it just taking of life in certain circumstances?
Thank you. Okay, so without reading everything here, but we've got several examples from the New Testament. We're going to get to this one on the last slide. I heard the 5-minute warning. Matthew 5:21 through 22. You have heard it was said to the ancient ones, you shall not murder. Whoever shall murder shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say unto you that anyone who's angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, raka, which means empty or worthless, is answerable to the court, and anyone who says you fool will be in danger of the fire of hell. Matthew 5:19, and it's amazing how many times this comes up, and it's again going right back to the foundation, the commandments. Because I used a lot of these verses already in preparing for the next sermon on don't commit adultery, because they're together. So Matthew 25, Matthew 23, Matthew 27. So the examples. So Saul fully approved of the murder, right? When Saul was watching over those early Christians to bring them. But Saul, still breathing threats, went to the high priest. Information of their intention was given to him. They even watched the gates in order to murder him. Romans 1, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder. Romans 13. They continue in James, do not commit adultery, do not commit murder. Now, if you do not commit adultery but murder, you've become a transgressor of the law. Just talking about the completeness of the law. 1 John, unlike Cain, who was of the evil one and killed his brother, why did he kill him? Because his works were evil and his brothers were righteous. So there's the jealousy aspect of the anger. So let's get into this part. So how does God take us beyond the physical act of murder? So it starts with murder is wrong. Don't hate, don't be angry, don't call names, like calling someone worthless. don't have a heart problem, what should we do instead? We should love. We should love God first and then love each other. Again, I refer you back to Daniel's lesson. It'll be on the website later today. Do care about each other. How do you serve each other? If you take away the anger and the hate and then substitute with serve and love and help, that's what we're supposed to be doing. So Matthew 15:19, for out of the heart comes forth evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, sexual sins, thefts, false testimony, blasphemies. Mark 7:21, for from within, out of the hearts. Matthew 5:21, we read that earlier. So the final question, how would this story of the Good Samaritan apply to this topic? How is the Good Samaritan has nothing to do with murder? And yet it might. Go ahead, David.
Well, do you have a heart to care for other people? Has the Word of God transformed your heart and transformed your purpose such that you live for others wholly with every fiber of your being? Jesus' message is so revolutionary in that we don't associate with the things in the Ten Commandments as far as doing them. I think we'd all agree that the dregs of society would include murderers and thieves. Someone out right now is burglarizing a home. I think we'd agree that's not a good person. And yet Christ comes in and says, you hypocrites, basically. And he's talking to us. You are those people. Why? Because that seed of that sin is in your heart when you hate. And we all suffer from that. So that this commandment is applicative to us in every single way.
That was the second bell. Again, you could probably have a whole series, class on just this one commandment. My intent was to try to kind of get us into how man has complicated things, and God kept it very simple. But it was very simple from an action perspective, a doing, but then he really wants us to extend it to, again, how do we treat each other? How do we respect God? So thank you all very much. See you all Wednesday, Lord willing.